Well, after securing a breakthrough deal, South Africa is set to receive about 131 billion rand in grants and loans from the world's richest countries to fund a move away from coal. Now, in recent times, the power utility has been called the world's worst polluting power company. And are emissions from Eskom so high? And environmental management and energy studies lecturer Kristy Langerman joins us to check how Eskom stacks up in the pollution stakes. And she joins us. Thank you so much for joining us, Kristy. Eskom has been called the world's worst polluting power company. And in Mpumalanga, where a majority of Eskom's power stations are located, has been dubbed one of the world's largest air pollution hotspots. But are emissions from Eskom really so high? And if so, why? And should we be worried about these emissions?
Yes, so thank you for the invitation to join you today. Well, there's no getting around it that the emissions from Eskom are high. Eskom burns a lot of coal. In comparison with any other country or with any other utility, Eskom does burn a lot of coal. So as a result, the carbon dioxide emissions from Eskom are high, on the order of about 200 million tons a year, which is more than 40% of South Africa's total CO2 emissions. And then there's also the air pollutants, the things that damage our health when we breathe them, things like sulfur dioxide, nitrogen oxides. And Eskom is also a large emitter of sulfur dioxide. And there have been lots of studies calculating the health effects, how many people become sick, how many people die early because of this. So clearly, I think this has been widely acknowledged. Eskom's emissions are high, and that's why we are engaging in this just transition. But what we as scientists still like to point out is that Eskom is not the only source of pollution. And normally, what the pollution that we breathe from Eskom is a relatively small proportion of the total pollution that we breathe. So we do need an approach in general to move to cleaner sources of energy and to address the multiple sources of air pollution that we have in our country.
Now, South Africa hasn't, like other countries, markedly decreased air pollutant emissions, like you also mentioned now, from the electricity sector, even, though they are one of the biggest polluters. But there are also technologies that we can use to do this. But why are we not using the current technology available to lessen these emissions?
Yeah. So Eskom's approach, historically, they have focused on reducing ash emissions. And they have been, if you look back to the 1980s and before, we've had a marked decrease in the ash emissions from Eskom's power stations. But if you look at sulfur dioxide, nitrogen oxides, there really hasn't been much of a decrease. And the main reason that Eskom gives for that is that it simply costs too much at this stage for them to retrofit their power stations. You are looking at tens of billions of rands, just to retrofit one power station. So it does cost a lot. And then they also cite secondary reasons like the flue gas desulfurization technology that is needed to reduce sulfur dioxide emissions. It uses more water, which isn't always available. There are a number of other reasons, but I think it's primarily a cost thing. Should we spend our money in building solar and wind? Should we spend it upgrading our new power stations? Should we find a balance? Unfortunately, we do have limited resources.
But then ultimately, I think then what is the answer? Because, South Africa wants to improve air quality and meet climate change goals, but it needs to move away from coal. And we've heard government's plans as well to switch to so-called green hydrogen energy. How effective and feasible do you think this plan is? And is this also the best or the only answer to the country's power crisis?
Well, I do think the just transition is the solution, but there is no silver bullet within the just transition. So we need to move from a state of relying on fossil fuels, and it's easy, relatively easy, to generate electricity, to get useful forms of energy from fossil fuel because it's on demand. You tell a gas station or a coal station how much electricity you need at a certain time, and within limits they can give it to you. But once we start relying on renewables, on wind, on solar, which obviously need to be linked to green hydrogen, is one of the things they need to be linked to. Suddenly, they're available when they're available, and when they're not, we need a plan. And so that then we need a much more complex electricity and energy supply system, drawing on renewables, making use of storage. Obviously, green hydrogen is another great energy carrier that needs to be brought into the mix.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So this is probably where developed nations will play a role, am I right?
I agree. There's costs are always higher up front. So we're wanting them, and they are, going ahead, trying out the technologies, using them until the costs become cheaper. And then we're going to follow and see what works. But, we also don't want to lose this chance to play a leading role. And I think green hydrogen is one of the places that South Africa is trying to position that we can be a global leader.
That's very important. We can be a global leader, and we do have the resources to pull that off. Hopefully COP26 will give us some more clarity on what we can do as South Africa to move forward and get more green energy into the country.